Okay, guys, last chapter, and then we're going to move on to book 3. Chapter 30 is called The Goodbye. Connor woke up the next morning with a mission. Before anyone else had woken, he ran down to the stables and arranged for a carriage to take him to the countryside. He kept his activities a complete secret from anyone else, fearing someone would stop him if he made his plans known. He didn't return until that evening, just before dusk, and he didn't return alone. The carriage door swung open, and 3 additional passengers emerged from it. Connor had brought Lady Iris, Petunia, and Rosemary back with him. After they'd spent nearly a decade suffering through constant public persecution, Connor had offered them the only chance at refuge they had ever received. And after hearing hours of Connor's descriptions, the sequestered family of women finally jumped at the chance. They were carrying as many of their belongings as they could. Lady Iris held on to the painting of her late husband. Rosemary held her favorite cooking bowl, and Petunia grasped a stack of rolled-up animal portraits under her arm. "There's this thing called culinary school that you're going to love, Rosemary," Connor was saying, further listing the perks of his dimension. "And just wait until I introduce you to Animal Planet, Petunia." Sir Lambton emerged down the front steps of the palace towards the carriage. "What's going on here?" he asked Connor. Connor pulled him aside so the woman couldn't hear him. "I'm taking them back to the other world with us," he said. "You're what?" Lambton said. "I explained everything to them. It took them a while to understand, but they want to leave," Connor said. "Lambton, they're miserable here. They don't gain anything by staying. If they come with us, they'll at least have a chance at starting a better life." "Why would you help them?" Lambton asked. Connor sighed and looked to the ground. "Because I'll never be able to help my sister," he said. "Alex isn't like me. She's going to be miserable the rest of her life without this place. At least if I bring Lady Iris with us here, there'll be something worth looking forward to." Lambton had his reservations, but admired the boy's generosity nonetheless. "You're a good man, Connor Bailey," he said. "Everyone is gathering in the gardens for the final goodbye. Please escort your guests down there." Connor nodded and led the women around the side of the castle to the beautiful gardens. The charming garden was home to an exquisite display of yellow roses, pear trees, and a hedge labyrinth. It was a beautiful place to say a distressing goodbye. Froggy Red, King Chance, Cinderella, and Mother Goose had already gathered in the gardens. Cinderella had to do a double take as Connor approached. She hadn't been expecting to see her stepmother and stepsisters walking behind him. "Stepmother?" Cinderella called out. "Rosemary? Petunia?" Even though they knew they were headed to the palace, Lady Iris and her daughters had almost hoped they wouldn't run into her. "Hello, Cinderella," Lady Iris said. "What are you doing here?" Cinderella asked. She looked over all the belongings they carried and answered her own question. Lady Iris thought for a moment about what to tell her. "We've decided it would be best to leave the charming kingdom," she said. "I see," Cinderella said. She didn't argue with her stepmother, knowing her reasons better than anyone. "Where are you headed?" Lady Iris hesitated to say. "The other world, as fate would have it," she said. "I think a fresh start would do the girls and me some good. We'll be able to live in a place where people won't judge us harshly, or throw rocks at the house, or boo us when we leave it." All Cinderella could do was nod. She might have built a gate around their property, but she could never take away all the oppression they faced on a daily basis. "What are you going to do there?" Cinderella asked. "The boy was telling me of a place called Florida that I might be interested in," Lady Iris said. "I'm going to be a chef," Rosemary said. "I'm going to do something with animals," Petunia said. "They have so many more animals in the other world than we have. There's apparently this creature called the honey badger that I hear is fascinating." Cinderella was pleased for them, but couldn't deny she was sorry to be losing the only family she had outside the king and the princess. "I'm so happy for you," she said, although they knew better. "We're doing this for you too, Cinderella," Lady Iris said. "You won't have any black sheep to worry about lingering around now. You can raise Princess Hope without ever having to tell her about us, if you'd like." Cinderella nodded. "But I plan on telling Hope everything about you," she said, "especially the part about her grandmother helping a small band of courage Courageous sailors defeat the evil Chantress who took her from us." Lady Iris hadn't expected them to remember her request. "Did they tell you I assisted?" she asked. "No, they didn't have to," Cinderella said. She pulled a ring off her finger she wore next to her wedding ring. It was her stepmother's wedding ring. "The wand, it was part of it was destroyed, but I recognized the ring. Any girl would recognize her own mother's wedding ring. I figured you would want it back." Lady Iris stared down at the ring. "I don't know what to say," she said, touched by the gesture. The girl she had been so cruel to was still showing her kindness, even now. "Thank you, Cinderella. You continue to grow into a much better woman than I ever could be." Cinderella smiled. She hugged her stepmother and her stepsisters for the first and final time. Red and Froggy took their lead to start their own goodbyes. "I'm going to miss you, old chap," Froggy said to Connor and gave him a giant hug. "I'm going to miss you too," Connor said. "And just to let you know, whenever I think about you, I'm always going to remember a giant frog." Froggy chuckled. "I wouldn't have it any other way," he said. Red kissed Connor on the cheek. "You are the sweetest boy I know," she said. "Then again, I rarely socialize with anyone of a lower age or social class." "Hey, kid," Mother Goose said, and pulled Connor aside. She slipped a blue poker chip into his hand. "If you're ever in Monte Carlo, go to the roulette table in the northwest corner of the Luminaire des Etoiles Casino and bet this on black." She winked at him and patted him firmly on the back. "Thanks," Connor said. The Fairy Council arrived promptly a few moments later. They took their positions in a big half circle around the gardens to begin sealing the gateway between the worlds. "We're just waiting for the fairy godmother and the others," Esmeralda said. "If those of you leaving this world would please just take a step forward." Connor, Lady Iris, Rosemary, and Petunia all edged forward on the grass, stepping into the center of the crescent shape the council formed. "Here they come now," Skylene said. Connor turned to see his grandmother, Charlotte, Bob, and his sister walking down from the palace. Bob was carrying one of the golden mirrors his grandmother had convinced the Fairy Council of approving securely under his arm. Connor avoided looking at his sister, knowing whatever devastated expression was on her face would make him more heartbroken than he already was. As soon as his grandmother reached the gardens, she threw her arms around Connor and said a tearful goodbye. You take good care of yourself, do you understand?" she said to him. "I love you, Grandma," Connor said. "And I love you, my darling boy," she said, and wiped the tears off of her face. "I'm going to talk to you every Sunday, even evening through the mirror. I don't care how busy you are, there is no excuse to miss it." She playfully pointed her finger at him. "I'll be there," he laughed. The sun began to set and the sky darkened. All the fairies in the half circle nodded to one another. "It's time," Esmeralda said. "Fairy Godmother, if you will please create a portal for our travelers for the last time." The Fairy Godmother reluctantly nodded. She stood in the front of the council, and they joined hands behind her. The wind began to pick up and circled around them as their spell began, blowing the petals of her pear blossom around like a blizzard. The Fairy Godmother waved her crystal wand and cracked it like a whip. A large tear appeared in the air as if the worlds had been ripped by the seams. Everyone stared at it in awe. Connor could see the living room of their rental house on the other side of it. "It's done," the Fairy Godmother said, and turned back to the other fairies. "As soon as the portal closes, the gateway will be closed forever." The top and bottom of the portal began retracting inward, and the seam between the worlds started closing for good. Charlotte and Bob joined Connor and the woman in the center, but Alex stayed behind by the fairies. "Alex, come on, let's go," Connor called to his sister. Alex didn't move. For the first time, Connor noticed she wasn't wearing her normal clothes. Instead, she wore a bright blue robe that sparkled like a night sky, just like their grandmother's. A headband made of the same white flowers their grandmother wore was in Alex's hair, and she held a long crystal wand, also like her grandmother's. "Alex, why are you dressed like that?" Connor asked. Alex's eyes welled up instantly. She looked from her mother to her grandmother for support and took a deep breath before breaking the news to him. "Because I'm staying," Alex said. Connor felt like he had been kicked in the stomach. "You're what?" he said. Alex had known this world would be the most difficult moments of her life, but she never could imagine it was going to be this hard. "I'm staying here with Grandma," Alex said. "I was going to tell you this morning, but you were gone by the time I woke up." Connor couldn't believe what he was hearing. He didn't want to believe it. He turned to his mother, hoping she would talk sense into his sister. "Mom, tell Alex she's crazy if she thinks she's staying here," he said. But his mother didn't immediately reprimand her like he had expected. She just gazed at Alex with large, watery eyes. "She's telling the truth, Connor," Charlotte said. Connor looked back and forth between them, shaking his head. "No, this can't be real," he said to himself. "Why would you let her do something like that?" Charlotte placed a hand on her son's shoulder. "One day, when you have kids, Connor, you'll discover that your biggest fear is not always making good decisions for your children. And while I know I'll always regret the decision to let her stay, I'll always know it was the right decision," she said. "You know as much as I do that your sister belongs here." Connor felt like he had been ambushed. He looked to his grandmother, but there was no signs of an alternate answer in her eyes. "Alex, what about school?" Connor said. "What about graduation? What about college? What about starting families of our own someday? Are you just going to throw all of those things away?" Alex wiped the tears from her face, even though they were quickly replaced with fresh streams. "There's nothing you're going to say now or in a year that I wouldn't have thought about 100 times, Alex said. "This isn't easy for me, Connor, but I know it's what I have to do." "You mean you've been planning this?" Connor said. He was so angry she had even considered something so drastic without telling him. "I've thought about it every day since we got back the first time," Alex said. "I never thought the conditions would be so severe, but it was even in the Snow Queen's prophecy. We just didn't recognize it. Of the 4 travelers, 1 will not return." She was talking about you, me, Bob, and Mom. We were the 4 travelers, not the ones aboard the Granny. "You're going to regret this," Connor said. "One day you're going to look back and wish you hadn't left me and Mom." "No, I won't," Alex said, "because I couldn't live without this world now that I know how much it offers me." Connor felt like he was in a nightmare. "Alex, I've never been anywhere without you in my entire life," Connor said. "We can't live apart, worlds apart." "Don't you get it, Connor?" Alex said. "We were always meant to live worlds apart. Magic chose us to be the bridge between the 2 worlds. It's the reason there are 2 of us. I was always meant to stay here and succeed Grandma in magic, and you were meant to go to the other world and continue her storytelling. Do you think it's just a coincidence that you turned out to be such a good writer?" Every fiber of his being wanted to argue with her. Every inch of him wanted to reject what she was telling him. But something about seeing his sister among the fairies made him feel like everything was right in the world, even though his was crashing around him. Alex stepped towards him and gave him the biggest hug she could ever given him. "We'll always be together, Connor," Alex said. "In our hearts and in your stories. Every time you pen another story about our adventures in the land of stories, I'll be right there with you. And when that isn't enough, we can always see each other in the mirrors." Esmeralda was the only one eyeing the portal. "The gateway is closing," she said. "You have to leave soon before you're all trapped in this world." For every tear that rolled down Connor's face, there was a dozen he fought back. He knew there was no going back now. Alex had made up her mind. There were so many things to say and not enough time to say it. Connor made sure to make his final moments with his sister count and said the only thing that mattered. "I love you, Alex," he said and hugged her. "I love you too, Connor," she said and hugged him back. They both could feel each other's tears on their backs of their necks. One by one, Lady Iris, Rosemary, Petunia, and Bob stepped through the seam between the worlds and disappeared. Charlotte gave Alex one last hug before stepping through it, and Connor followed her. He watched his sister through the seam as it slowly closed, and the fairy tale world vanished before his eyes. They were now dimensions apart, yet both the twins were finally home. Alex was right. Connor could still feel her in his heart. However, underneath the pain of saying goodbye was a lingering certainty that their goodbye wouldn't last forever. Despite what the fairies told him, Connor knew in his heart that his and Alex's story was far from over.